Tragically, as soldiers experience the horror and cruelty of war, especially urban counterinsurgency war, the moral gravity of their actions become apparent, displacing, torturing, injuring, and killing other human beings. As a consequence, soldiers suffer not only the effects of trauma, but of moral injury as well. That is, debilitating remorse, guilt, shame, disorientation, and an alienation from the remainder of the moral community. Now, the observation that some human beings become moral casualties because of their experiences in war is not new. Historically, many societies have recognized war's deleterious moral effects and required returning warriors to undergo elaborate atonement and purification rituals, that is, quarantine, penances, smoke lodge, etc. These therapies provided the means and the opportunity for the returning warriors to cope with the moral enormity of their actions in war. Tragically, the moral injuries of modern warriors, however, have been virtually ignored, overlooked, or disregarded by the conventional therapeutic community, operating as it does within a Nietzschean, Freudian scientific legacy that views ethical concerns as clinically irrelevant. Autonomous man, we are told, ought to feel no guilt nor bite of conscience for his actions. Focusing instead upon stress and trauma, most moral symptoms presented by returning soldiers are either not taken seriously or assimilated under the diagnostic umbrella of post-traumatic stress disorder. Consequently, the veterans received a signal that an inability to forget, to put the war behind them, is either weakness or perhaps worse, illness. Accordingly, veterans are advised to ignore what has occurred, to de-responsibilize, that is, to neutralize their feelings by accepting the naturalness of their behavior in specialized environments, like a battlefield, and or to undergo a myriad of conventional therapies, psychoanalytic, behavioral, pharmacological, etc., intended to enable them to deal with the stress and trauma of their experiences. In either approach, moral considerations are, for the most part, irrelevant. Unfortunately, in most cases, moral injury neither responds well to medication, nor can it be rationalized away. In fact, such methods, according to psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, tend to alienate the individual still further. Such therapeutic advice as forget it, live with it, act as though it never happened, or don't worry about it, human beings act that way in survival situations, does little to alleviate the veteran's moral pain and suffering. Now, whatever their source, and however the process occurs, humankind has, for the most part, accepted and internalized a set of values and norms through which we define ourselves as persons, structure our world, and render our relationship to it and to other human beings comprehensible. These values and norms provide the parameters of our being, what I have termed our moral identity. Consequently, we now have the need and the means to weigh concrete situations to determine acceptable, right, and unacceptable, wrong behavior. Now, one critical moral conviction, foundational to the moral identity of most rational human beings, can best be described as a principle of respect for persons. Inherent in this Kantian moral principle, philosopher Immanuel Kant, is a recognition that human beings possess unconditional, that is, intrinsic moral value, and consequently that they must be treated with respect, that is, as ends in themselves, and not only as a means to the ends of other human beings or nations. In his landmark study of the behavior of United States soldiers during war, the Army Chief Historian, General S.L.A. Marshall, has reported that only 15 to 20% of men in battle, even those facing immediate threat, actually fired their weapons at the enemy. Ardant du Pic reported that during the Napoleonic Wars, many soldiers fired almost into the air without aiming. Richard Gabriel points out that although the primitive and warlike New Guinean tribesmen are excellent marksmen with their bows during hunting, when they go to war, the warriors remove the feathers from their arrows, rendering their weapons relatively ineffective, thereby keeping casualties low. Similarly, among many Native American tribes, it brought the warrior more respect and esteem merely to touch the enemy, to count coup, rather than to kill him. Paddy Griffith's study of the Civil War battlefield notes that a regiment of soldiers, usually numbering between 200 and 1,000 men, most of whom were adequate, if not expert, marksmen, although leveling an incredible volume of fire at the exposed enemy, at close distances, some 20 to 30 yards perhaps, killed or injured only 1 or 2 men per minute. Now this is an incredibly low kill ratio, and it was not an isolated phenomenon peculiar to the Civil War or to a particular level of weapons technology. A study conducted by the British Operational Analysis Establishment in 1986 analyzed more than 100 19th and 20th century battles and concluded that the killing potential of the forces engaged in these battles were much greater than the recorded casualty rate that was achieved. Now they explain this phenomenon as indicating an unwillingness by the participants to take part in the combat as the main factor. So I think ample evidence exists to support the contention that soldiers on the battlefield have, throughout the history of warfare, avoided killing their counterparts if at all possible. Marshall concluded from his study, and I quote, "It is therefore reasonable to believe that the average and healthy individual, the man who can endure the mental and physical stresses of combat, still has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance toward killing a fellow man, that he will not of his own volition take life if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility." End of quote. Psychologist and former Army Ranger David Grossman is more specific. He maintains that there exists in humankind a natural and innate reluctance toward killing members of one's own species. He writes, and I quote, "There is within most men an intense resistance to killing their fellow man, a resistance so strong that in many circumstances soldiers on the battlefield will die before they can overcome it." End of quote. Something that needs to be overcome, obviously. As may be expected, the prevalence of moral injuries suffered by those who fought in a morally ambiguous war, or in a counterinsurgency guerrilla war, such as in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, where, for example, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant is obscure at best, will be significantly greater, and the symptoms more severe. However, and this is critical, all wars yield moral casualties. J. Glenn Gray, a philosopher and intelligence officer during World War II, writes of an incident in which an elderly couple, accused of being Gestapo agents, had committed suicide following his having questioned them quite harshly. He writes, and I quote, "The incident affected me quite strongly and still does. I was directly or indirectly the cause of their deaths. I hope it will not rest too hard on my conscience, and yet, if it does not, I shall be disturbed as well." Now, Gray's insights are especially valuable, I think, as they illustrate that even the actions and experiences of those involved in a good war and not directly confronting the enemy on the battlefield can precipitate moral injury. Consequently, those military theorists, and there are many, who have argued that debilitating remorse, guilt, shame, etc. may be avoided by educating soldiers, probably convincing is better, about the justness and necessity of war and the appropriateness of their combat behavior, could benefit from Gray's observations. Now I will interpret this evidence as indicating, at least, that rational men and women have, for whatever the reason, adopted, internalized, and acted upon a standard of behavior that proscribes killing members of one's own species, the principle of respect for persons. If in fact humankind is biologically predisposed to respond using violence to certain external stimuli, such a predisposition, I would argue, has been effectively offset by the societal mores and ethical values instilled in us and we have internalized during our formative childhood years. Human beings, then, and this is critical, are not killers by nature. Soldiers are not born killers. Killers have to be created. Political and military leaders whose aim it is to further their national goals and objectives through violence have recognized that this reluctance to kill, this foundational aspect of a human being's moral identity, jeopardizes their ability to wage war effectively. Consequently, following the Second World War, warrior preparation, basic training boot camp, was modified to shift its focus from acquainting soldiers with tactics and weaponry to rather sophisticated techniques of value manipulation, moral desensitization, and psychological conditioning aimed at destroying, overriding the recruit's moral aversion to killing. Now, the goals of this modified basic military training are fivefold. First, late adolescents, young adults, undergoing an important psychosocial stage in personality development, are, through rigid discipline, dehumanization, and intense physical, psychological, and emotional manipulation, pressure, and abuse, the characterization of, the normal characterization of boot camp. These young adults are reduced to a state of extreme helplessness and vulnerability in order to effect what I term moral identity, disassociation, and conversion. That is, the destruction of their non-martial moral identity and its appropriate beliefs, values, loyalties, and attributes of character. Such attributes, such values as kindness, mercy, compassion, consideration, benevolence, forgiveness, charity, sympathy, etc. In favor of the beliefs, values, loyalties, and attributes of character more appropriate to their new identity as warriors, their new identity as killers. Such characteristics as loyalty to comrades, courage, patriotism, obedience, brutality, cruelty, viciousness, ferocity, inhumanity, ruthlessness, etc. Now, I'm not trying to degrade members of the military. I'm just trying to bring out the reality that military forces, elite military forces, are held in high esteem not because of an ability to use reason, to sit down with an enemy and work out differences of points of view. The reality is that SEALs, for example, are held in high esteem because of their brutality, their cruelty, their ability to kill. That's the reality of war. Second, the reality of combat is such that few men kill or are willing to die for ideology, issues of justice, for God or for country. That goes out the window very quickly, soon after experiencing combat. What ultimately motivates soldiers to kill and to die in battle is personal honor, self-respect, and loyalty and accountability to comrades. Consequently, basic military training seeks the destruction of the recruit's concept of themselves as individuals and fosters instead a group identity and esprit de corps, a military cohesion or brotherhood or sisterhood of the warrior. Now this phenomenon, sociologically termed grouping or crowding, also allows for the development of a sense of anonymity, a diffusion of responsibility, and a group absolution, thereby lessening, at least temporarily, a sense of personal responsibility for their actions. It is, therefore, the recruit's own vision of themselves as part of a select group of warriors with a proud, noble, and chivalrous tradition, a dynamic I term the warrior mythology, that effectively enables them to ignore the ethical limits they would normally place upon the use of violence. Third, while the official military position is that blind obedience is not the goal of warrior preparation, soldiers are, after all, morally and legally responsible to differentiate lawful from unlawful orders, and are bound only to obey the former, the lawful variety. Most sincere and pragmatic military leaders would agree that an immediate response to orders on the battlefield is an absolute necessity. Essentially, then, basic military training conditions recruits to respond to orders immediately, automatically, and without question. The old soldier's adage, "Ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die," certainly captures the reality of military discipline. Fourth, to be successful in battle, recruits must develop an immediate killing response. Basic military training, therefore, programs recruits utilizing a number of clearly Pavlovian stimulus response exercises, what's called reflexive fire training or conditioning. That is, to react automatically and without hesitation to an enemy and kill him. Success is rewarded with praise and medals, and those that prove unsuccessful suffer the wrath of the drill instructor, the guilt and shame of letting down their peers, and the possibility of failing to graduate from basic training. Fifth, war is inevitably overwhelming, and killing another human being an awesome act normally antithetical to ordinary conceptions of morality. Consequently, an important goal of basic training is to create distance between the warrior and those they must kill, by accentuating and fabricating the enemy's cultural, racial, ethnic, and moral differences. That is, to instill in the recruits an abstract perception of the enemy as evil, demonic, subhuman, non-human, and socially inferior. And now the rhetoric we use, the language we use in warrior preparation reflects distancing. We refer to the enemy, when during the Vietnam War, we referred to the enemy not as persons, not as human beings, but as dinks and gooks and slants. And now the Afghans and Iraqis are referred to as hajis and towel heads. It is clear, therefore, that since the end of the Second World War, nations have entered a new era of warrior preparation. These indoctrination techniques, characterized by profound psychological and value manipulation and conditioning, have proven quite successful indeed, as studies indicate that the percentage of soldiers in battle who fired their weapons at the enemy increased to 55% during the Korean War and to 95% during the Vietnam War. Now, I know of no study that's been done regarding the modern-day soldiers, the current soldiers, but I have no reason to believe that they are any less lethal. Upon completing basic training, most soldiers view themselves as part of a select group of courageous knights, with a noble and chivalric tradition, willing, programmed to kill the demonic agents of evil, and successfully and selflessly to sacrifice their lives if need be for right and for justice. With combat, however, as the screams of the mutilated and the dying quickly replace the sounds of inspiring anthems, and the chaos, insanity, and horror of the battlefield become apparent, comes the realization that however just the goal and righteous the initial intent, in the words of William Tecumseh Sherman, war is destruction and nothing else. It is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. Consequently, as the warrior's mythology begins to crumble, ideology and the lofty and abstract ideals of chivalry and patriotism become irrelevant. War becomes a struggle for personal survival and revenge. Confronted by this reality, serious doubts and moral uneasiness arise regarding war's necessity and justness, and of the nobility and righteousness of the warrior's involvement. In many, if not most cases, whether this occurs after the fact, after having returned home, or while still in theater, the deception is inevitably revealed and the mythology destroyed, and the warrior is left to confront the anguish and grief, the moral distress and confusion at having violated this deep-seated principle of respect for persons that is so integral to their pre-programming moral identity. To correctly identify and to adequately treat the injury suffered by our servicemen and women in war, we must understand and take account of the moral values and norms by which we define ourselves as persons. We structure our world and render our relationship to it and to other human beings comprehensible. We must realize that these values and norms provide the parameters of our being. Most importantly, we must recognize that combat behavior often violates our moral identity and negatively impacts our social esteem, our self-image, and our integrity, causing debilitating remorse, guilt, shame, disorientation, and alienation from the remainder of the moral community. That is, moral injury. In a poem I entitled Warrior's Dance, that's Tai Chi Chuan, I practiced in Vietnam, I offer a poetic description of my state of mind at the time. I fear I am no longer alien to this horror. I am the horror. I have lost my humanity and have embraced the insanity of war. The monster and I are one, so I dance. The dance of warriors. Amidst decaying corpses and forsaken loved ones I dance. I have feasted upon their flesh, and with their blood have quenched my thirst. The blood of innocence forever stains my soul. The transformation is complete, and I can never return. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I think this poetic expression of a warrior's of my perception of self is common to many who share the experience. It suggests a recognition of the horrors associated with war, a stoic dismay at having embraced the mythological warrior identity, an awareness of having transgressed a more deeply seated sense of self, the non-martial moral identity, a perceived culpability for my actions, and an acceptance of the consequent sanctions for my crimes, that is, profound remorse, guilt, and shame. Also indicated is the abandonment, isolation, and alienation from the remainder of the moral community many warriors suffer following their return to a society in which killing is murder, and cruelty, brutality, and violence, the behavioral characteristics and values so appropriate to the martial identity, and are now unacceptable. Whether we act rightly or wrongly, that is, whether we act according to or in violation of our moral identity, it will affect whether we perceive ourselves as true to our personal convictions and to others who share our values and our ideals. Moral injuries, then, are, in most cases, an inevitable consequence of the sophisticated manipulation and distortion during basic training of the recruits' moral foundations, their moral identities, and the profound moral confusion and distress they experience as the horror and insanity, the reality of war becomes apparent, and they are confronted by a realization of the moral gravity of their actions in combat. Moral guilt is, simply speaking, the awareness of having transgressed our moral convictions, and the anxiety precipitated by a perceived breakdown of our ethical cohesion, and an alienation from the moral community. Shame is the loss of self-esteem, consequent to a failure to live up to personal and communal expectations. I want to conclude with a portion of a poem that I wrote that I sort of tongue-in-cheek entitled War Crazy. I wrote this a significant time after my return from Vietnam, somewhat after, I guess, a time when I achieved some sort of awareness of what I did and what I became. This is War Crazy. I have always thought myself a free spirit, a philosopher mendicant seeking an alternative, more substantive lifestyle. So many others, however, have seen my unorthodoxy, my spiritual seeking, as abnormal and a clear indication of my insanity. Perhaps I need to pause and to reevaluate my life. After all, being insane is not something one readily admits. I guess it's part of being crazy to cling to a facade of sanity, to think oneself normal and everyone else insane. One thing I am certain of, however, I haven't always been crazy, wasn't born crazy. I think insanity crept up on me, happened in Vietnam, in the war. War does that, you know, drives people crazy. Shell shock, battle fatigue, combat exhaustion, soldiers' heart, PTSD, moral injury, all that killing and dying can make anyone crazy. Now some survive war quite well, they tell me. Many even benefit from its virtues. But war's effects are not always apparent. No one escapes war unscathed in body and in mind. All war, any war, every war, ain't no virtue in war. I think of those not driven crazy by war. Many were crazy already, but theirs was an insanity of a different kind, a hard kind, an uncaring kind. I knew people like that. While I didn't like them much, I thought them fortunate, as killing and dying meant nothing. In fact, in a perverse way, they enjoyed it. Enjoyed the jazz, the excitement, the power. They became avenging angels, even God herself, making decisions of life and death. But mostly death. Those crazies hated to see the war end. For me, the war never ends. Sometimes things work out for the best, though, as my unorthodoxy, my being crazy, probably saved my life. You see, sane people can't live like this, in a war that never ends. Not all crazy people can either. Guess I was lucky. Sometimes being crazy helps you cope. Sometimes I wish I was crazier than I am. Thank you very much.